Welcome. I'm Lee Cowan, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. Journalist Anderson Cooper literally wrote the book on his own famous family when he published A Look into the Vanderbilts back in 2021. Now he's examining another influential American dynasty, the Astors, whose fortune was built, as Cooper tells Kelefa Sanneh, as slumlords in New York City.
Is there anyone good in this story of the Astors?
Look, people are multifaceted, and I think every family has heroes and villains.
That sounds like a no. If someone asks whether I'm a good person and the answer is, well, he's multifaceted, that's not a good sign.
Later in the show, Anderson Cooper on how today's titans of industry are shaping our modern world.
I wonder, as I read your books and think about the ways these families literally physically shape the city, and it made me wonder, are the new billionaires shaping our physical environment in the same way?
I don't know if it's physical environment, but I mean, they're shaping, our certainly our social environment and our technological environment. So yeah, perhaps wisely, I'm sure they have incredible houses, but they're not putting their entire fortunes into mega mansions that will be torn down in a generation. At least I assume they're not, or their fortunes are so big they can do both.
The Astor family purchased New York real estate in part with riches earned through the beaver fur trade. These days, beavers are valuable for a host of reasons. They're as cute as can be, for one. But the ecosystems they create also have real benefits for humans.
Beavers have this great new role to play because they can help us with every environmental problem we have that's being accelerated by climate change, fire and drought and flood.
That's right. It may seem counterintuitive, but beaver dams actually reduce catastrophic flooding by sending more water into the ground.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. The Astor family once ruled New York City society, and they own a substantial slice of the city's real estate, too. Anderson Cooper traces the family's roots from their first American patriarch, a German immigrant, to the philanthropist heir who gave away almost all of their fortune. Here's Kelefa Sanneh.
John Jacob Astor and then his son, for generations, they were just buying up parcels here and there and then large tracts of land further north.
Astor Place in New York's Greenwich Village is named for John Jacob Astor, America's first multimillionaire. Astor died in 1848 with one regret. He wished he had bought more real estate.
Yeah, there's a famous quote, had I to do it over again, I would have, put every nickel I had in New York real estate.
Astor made his money through the bloody and brutal beaver fur trade.
He saw the huge markups that beaver fur could get, 600, 700, 800% markups. And John Jacob Astor went out into the wilderness and started trading with indigenous populations.
By 1834, his fur trading company was the largest business enterprise in the United States.
It was also a ruthless business, the way he operated.
Astor was astonishingly ruthless, according to Anderson Cooper's new book, co-written with historian Katherine Howe.
He would screw over the traders that worked for him. They would have to buy them at marked up prices, so then their incentive was to screw over the indigenous populations who they were trading beaver pelts from.
And by the next generation, you have William Astor, who owns all these buildings in New York. You refer to him as a slumlord.
Yes. I mean, the Astors were slumlords, there's no doubt about it. They would rent out the land to a sub-landlord, and that sub-landlord's business was to build whatever building they wanted on that land. But within 20 years or so, the lease would be up, and anything built on that land would revert to the Astor family. So there was no incentive for any sub-landlord to keep up a building.
Today, the Astor name is etched into the infrastructure of New York City.
This is the Astor Place subway station, which still has a kind of an homage to the Astor family and to their origins. A lot of people probably wonder, why are there beavers here chewing on trees? And this is a reference to the creation of the Astor fortune.
Beavers are adorable, but the Astors... Is there anyone good in this story of the Astors?
Look, people are multifaceted, and I think every family has heroes and villains.
That sounds like a no. If someone asks whether I'm a good person and the answer is, well, he's multifaceted, that's not a good sign.
One of Cooper's favorite Astors wasn't originally part of the family. Brooke Astor, born Roberta Brooke Russell, was the third and final wife of Vincent Astor, who had become the richest man in America after his father, Jack Astor, died aboard the Titanic.
Vincent Astor realized, wait a minute, we're slumlords? He was not happy to learn this. He was definitely not easy to be around. Smoked, drank, unbelievable amount.
He sold off some of the family's assets and started a foundation with what Cooper describes as a vague notion of bettering humankind. He died in 1959, leaving his fortune and foundation to his widow, Brooke.
In that 5.5 years of often miserable marriage, she put up with a lot, and she inherited all of Vincent Astor's money. And she rehabilitated the Astor name.
She really embraced this idea of being both an Astor
Yes.
and a philanthropist, right?
Yes. Brooke Astor focused on giving back to New York City, and she would dress up in her fur coats and her Chanel, and she would go to housing projects and homeless shelters because she wanted to see how the money she was giving would be spent. That was Brooke Astor.
Cooper and co-author Katherine Howe at times rely heavily on a handful of sources, which has raised some questions about the diligence of their research. We asked Cooper about this. He replied, "We have written what we hope is a compelling and accessible account of the Astors, and have relied on, and rigorously cited, dozens of books, contemporary accounts, and historical documents." In the book, Cooper also recalls his personal interactions. As a 13-year-old, he first met Brooke Astor while at lunch with his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt.
Your mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, really the last of the Vanderbilts in a way. Brooke Astor, the last of the Astors.
Yeah. If somebody passing by the restaurant in that moment had seen Brooke Astor and my mom sitting, shoulder to shoulder, essentially, that's the thought they would have had. Like, these two sort of iconic, representatives of a vanishing past.
Cooper says his mother and Brooke were not friends.
Brooke Astor was the toast of New York society, and my mom chose a different path, and I think that's part of the tension she felt with Brooke Astor.
Gloria, who was born a Vanderbilt, was someone Brooke probably would have wanted to befriend, a reversal from more than a century earlier, when the Astors wanted nothing to do with the Vanderbilts.
The Vanderbilts were considered the nouveau riche. Commodore Vanderbilt died with $100 million, but he also was a very uncouth guy. It was the Commodore's grandchildren who set about this enterprise of breaking into New York society.
That meant getting past Caroline Astor, who created and controlled New York's social register. She called it the Astor 400.
Which was allegedly the 400 people who could fit in Caroline Astor's ballroom. And they created the rules for it. You had to have a French chef and French architecture. She defined it in a way that benefited her.
But Cooper's great-great-aunt, Alva Vanderbilt, found a way in.
She decided to throw a party the likes of which America had never seen. And Caroline Astor's daughter, Carrie, really wanted to go to this party. Finally, Caroline Astor folded to the pressure, and Mrs. Astor finally recognized the Vanderbilts.
Anderson Cooper says he always knew there would be no Vanderbilt money left for his inheritance. He swears that was fine with him. Inheriting wealth never ends well, he says. Brooke Astor spent her final years struggling with her son from a previous marriage, Tony Marshall.
When Brooke Astor decided to step back from the foundation because of Alzheimer's, she decided not to give it to Tony.
Basically telling him, one day, none of this will be yours.
Yes.
And yet, as Brooke Astor's mental faculties declined, her working relationship with her son became suspiciously close.
Tony was accused, ultimately, of stealing money from his mom, doing things without her knowledge.
He's eventually convicted of theft.
He stood trial. He was convicted.
This era of these great families kind of comes to an end. But of course, we have our Elon Musks and our Zuckerbergs. How do our plutocrats measure up to these older American plutocrats?
The histories have yet to be written about the mega wealthy people today and what the impact of their fortunes will be on subsequent generations and their families. Will the lessons of these other families be learned? I would recommend they read these books.
Up next, an exclusive excerpt from our chat with Anderson Cooper, something you can only see right here on CBS News Streaming. Stay with us.
She basically looked right through me, and she almost was going to smile when she heard her name. And then she looked at me and realized there was no need to, because I was sort of nobody.
As promised, here's more from Kelefa Sanneh and Anderson Cooper.
Tell me about the first time you met Brooke Astor.
I met Brooke Astor when I was 13 for the first time. I was in a restaurant called Mortimer's, which in New York in the early 80s, Mortimer's was like the see and be seen society restaurant. It was nothing to speak of. It was 2 small rooms. It was a very New York Upper East Side society restaurant. And one day, a little old lady in a big fur coat comes in, and I sort of recognized her. I'd seen some pictures of her in papers. She came by the table and she said something to my mom, and my brother and I stood up and we both shook her hand, and that was the first time I met Brooke Astor. And I knew right away my mom didn't like her. I could always just tell. I was like a student of my mom. She was a really interesting character, but I knew my mom didn't like her, so the conversation was short. But Brooke Astor was like seated right next to us. But after lunch, I asked my mom, what's up with Brooke Astor? Or I said, like, why don't you like her? I was like, I could tell you didn't like her. Why don't you like her? And all my mom would say was, she just never grabbed me. Which for my mom, it meant a lot. But my mom never would say bad things about people. She would just say oh yeah, she didn't grab me.
Do you like her more now, having written this book, than you did when you ran into her at that restaurant?
It's interesting. So I ran into her when I was 13 for the first time. A couple years later, I worked in that restaurant. I worked as a waiter in the restaurant one summer. And there was a moment I had another encounter with her where we were passing by each other in the restaurant. I was working. I was a terrible waiter. I was all sweating. And I said, oh, hi, Mrs. Astor. And she looked at me for a second, and our eyes met, and she clearly didn't remember. I'd met her by then several times as a kid with my mom. But she looked at me, and I was dressed in my waiter outfit, and she basically looked right through me. And she almost was going to smile when she heard her name. And then she looked at me and realized there was no need to, because I was sort of nobody. Right. And she just kept on walking. And maybe she was having a bad day, and I don't hold it against her. But for me at the time, when I was probably, 17 years old at the time, it was a really interesting experience to have. And I didn't view it as a judgment on her, but I just thought it taught me something.
I wonder, as I read your books and think about the ways these families literally physically shape the city. And it made me wonder, are the new billionaires shaping our physical environment in the same way?
I don't know if it's physical environment, but they're shaping, our certainly our social environment and our technological environment. So yeah, perhaps wisely, I'm sure they have incredible houses, but they're not putting their entire fortunes into mega mansions that will be torn down in a generation. At least I assume they're not, or their fortunes are so big they can do both. They can have huge houses and do other things. It seems like the question is not so much who makes the money and what they do with it. It's what happens to the money the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that.
Did having kids change the way you think about legacy and inheritance?
Yeah, it didn't change the way. First of all, having kids made me want to understand my mom's family story in a way that I never did before. Right. I thought no good could come of looking at the Vanderbilts because it has no impact on my life. I'm not inheriting any money from that. And it just seemed like, why have that as some sort of guidepost? I'd much rather look at the Coopers, and that seems like a more hard scrabble. That seems a more sensible guidepost to have. But when I had kids, I wanted to figure out what would I tell my kids about where they come from and who their great-great-grandparents were, and what would I say about this strange history? And so unless I could understand it myself, I didn't know what I would tell my kids. But I think for all of us, looking at the past, looking at the arc of American history through these families, I think it's an important thing. It gives us a sense of our own families and the cycles we see in our own families. This is clearly playing out in a very public way with the Astors or the Vanderbilts. But it is a story of an American family or an American fortune. And you see your own relatives in these people. You're like, oh yeah, it's the crazy uncle. That's that guy. Or it's the conniving guy, or whatever it is. And I find that really interesting.
Up next, meet the eager beavers. Welcome back. Beavers, prized for their warm, waterproof fur, were once on the brink of extinction. But through conservation efforts, these animals are now making a comeback, and it comes at perhaps when humans need them the most. Luke Burbank gets his hands dirty as he explores the misunderstood world of these industrious little creatures.
Leela Phillip remembers the exact moment it happened. She was walking her dog near her home in Connecticut.
And we were about right over there, and she froze, and next thing I knew, there was this crack. I thought a gun had gone off.
The sound was actually a beaver slapping its tail on the water to let her know she was in its neighborhood.
I looked and I saw, oh my God, it's filling with water. And then I saw trees were coming down over there. It was just incredible. It was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen. And it was the beavers making their pond.
That was the moment Phillip went from not thinking about beavers very much to becoming more or less obsessed. The result, her book, Beaverland, How One Weird Rodent Made America.
It's just incredible, the change that they bring into the land. And this is why they're called ecosystem engineers.
And in creating their own ecosystems, beavers actually do a lot for humans, slowing down water flow and creating wider, wetter environments.
It's so dry out there, that's fuel, like that is fire fuel. And then you get into here and the water, it's not gonna burn.
Emily Fairfax is assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, where she studies beavers, often in the bone-dry and sometimes wildfire-prone West.
If you look at these plants, if you pinch them, they are so full of water. The tissues are green and lush, and they're not withering, they're not crinkly, and that's hard to burn. You don't want to start a fire with wet material, and this is obviously very wet.
You're pretty certain there are beavers here because, of course, we have a dam, we have a lodge, but we also have, what did you just find?
I just found a beaver poop. And so these really highlight what beavers eat and what they don't eat, because if you look carefully, it's just plant material. It's just sawdust, like a little sawdust marshmallow, and it's pretty fresh. So we know the beavers have been here working recently because they're leaving poops in the water.
You really just handed me a beaver turd?
Did.
And I'm holding
Welcome to the field.
Kind of woody.
Yeah.
Fairfax says if we could see the California of 500 years ago with plentiful beaver, we'd see a greener landscape that would burn less easily.
Pre-European fur trade, the estimate is that there were between 100 million and 400 million beavers in North America. And for perspective, that's like about a beaver per kilometer of habitable stream. And that's like squirrels. They were everywhere.
But beaver fur was incredibly valuable to the Western explorers of North America.
Beaver felt was the Gore-Tex of its day. Everybody needed a beaver hat. You need to think of Mr. Darcy in London with the top hat. George Washington with his tricorn hat. That was made out of beaver felt. Beaver felt was incredibly valuable.
Native Americans hunted beaver, but in a way that allowed their populations to still thrive. That all changed when John Jacob Astor landed in New York.
John Jacob Astor comes over, his famous story of him coming over with 7 flutes, thinking he's going to start a music business. He overhears on board this ship people talking about fantastic sums they can make trading this item in London that they can get in North America for nothing. And he figures out it's beaver, and that's the beginning of America's first multimillionaire.
In just 100 years, the population of North American beaver dropped to near extinction levels, leading to all kinds of attempts to rebuild their numbers, including some truly bizarre ideas.
The plane makes a careful approach, ready for the drop.
In the 1950s, Idaho wildlife officials launched Operation Geronimo, parachuting almost 80 beavers into the backcountry, hoping they'd repopulate. And sure enough, it and other less high-flying reintroduction efforts seem to be working, according to Layla Phillip.
The beaver is one of North America's great success stories. They're a conservation comeback story, and that's why we have beavers now. And beavers have this great new role to play because they can help us with every environmental problem we have that's being accelerated by climate change, fire and drought and flood.
That's right. It may seem counterintuitive, but beaver dams actually reduce catastrophic flooding by sending more water into the ground. Still, of course, not everyone loves a beaver pond springing up on their property or near their kids' baseball field, but there are non-lethal ways to coexist with our furry neighbors, says Phillip, like something called a pond leveler.
Well, it's really beautifully simple. You basically put a pipe through the dam. It's like a permanent leak in the dam, and you lower the level of the pond.
Meanwhile, back at that original pond, the one that got Layla Phillip so obsessed, those beavers have moved on, leaving behind an ecosystem better than they found it. Something we humans might do well to consider ourselves.
Even this beaver meadow is so much richer with life and more full of water than before. So it's pretty remarkable.
I'm Lee Cowan. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you right here next time on Here Comes the Sun.